In today's video, we will be trying to discover what medieval Arab and Islamic armour was like and attempting to create an impression of an Arab soldier. So let's get straight into it, and welcome to the Golden Middle Age. If you've been watching our previous videos on this new series about the medieval Arab knight, you can see that we've tried to kind of lay some sort of groundwork leading up to this. We spoke about values and chivalry for soldiers in the medieval Islamic world. We spoke about battle tactics, horse armour, what Templars thought of Arab soldiers. But now we can actually get stuck in and start talking about armour, weapons and fighting. And the reason we spoke about these different topics in our previous videos is because these factors influence what armour was worn and what weapons were used. From the get-go, it's relatively clear that Arab and Islamic armour was generally lighter than European armour. I highly doubt you would see a soldier in the Middle East during the medieval era covered in plate armour from head to toe, like we see European knights wearing. It just wasn't practical. It didn't suit the style of fighting the armies adopted. And if you watched our video about medieval Arab armies, you can see that they preferred speed and mobility over being heavily armed. So in order to have speed and mobility, you needed to be lightly armed, especially given the fact that most Arab armies, starting from even before the medieval period, used an attack and retreat tactic. This meant that they would cause damage to the opponent by continually attacking and retreating. They used to do that a lot. And to be able to continuously attack and retreat, you needed to be mobile. And this is reflected in the armour they used to wear. And the second and obvious reason is the climate. In that region, even nowadays, it's hot, so covering yourself in steel plates from head to toe wouldn't be the best idea. Also in the Crusade era, European knights in the region didn't have steel plates because armour technology didn't even reach a level whereby they were able to make full steel plates of armour covering your body from head to toe. So let's start from the bottom going up to the head. Firstly, these regular medieval leather riding shoes will be our footwear for our medieval Arab soldier impression. And not much to say really on footwear. And moving upwards to the legs, what was most likely worn by soldiers going off to war would be something called a sirwal. And if you remember, we once done a video about women's clothing in the medieval times, and we said that women used to wear something like this, which is called a sirwal. And this was also used for soldiers going off to war. And generally speaking, it was a very practical piece of clothing. It's loose and baggy, which allows, a lot of freedom when you're running, when you're riding. And this would be good when you're on the battlefield. It gives you that extra room and flexibility and is actually very, very comfortable. Now, obviously, there may have been some greaves worn for the lower leg, defense. But this would probably be for those who had a higher status in society and wealth, because you needed to actually purchase your own armor from the major cities in Egypt or the Levant. So we're done with the sirwal and moving up to the torso and your upper body. And this made me have many debates with myself because it wasn't a straightforward and clear conclusion. If you watched the video about horse armor, I mentioned that researching armor in medieval Arab and Islamic history can be difficult. This is because, firstly, archaeological evidence is rare. Secondly, relying just on drawings would not be accurate enough. So what historians tend to do is look at the terminology that was used to describe armor and different types of weapons. The terminology can be sourced from manuscripts that were written or even the poetry that was recited. And because poetry was such a big thing in Arab society, in the pre-Islamic era and in the Middle Ages, poetry was plenty. You can find many poems which Arabs used to recite in the medieval times. And if you were a good poet, it meant that you were most likely to have a high position in society, or you were even very respected. So because this tradition of poetry carried on from the pre-Islamic era into the medieval times, terminology from poetry can be used. And the manuscripts, which we mentioned, the Mamluk manuscripts, which talk about Furusiyya, which means chivalry and riding horses. And this manuscript is actually called Nihayat al-Su'ud. This was a manuscript written in 1371 about how a horse rider should ride a horse and use a lance and other weapons, of course, from horseback. This is actually very fascinating, and we will definitely talk about this in future videos. So let's go back to the body armor. And for your information, I had to go through a process of elimination when trying to establish what the body armour was. The first part of body armour which was definitely worn was chainmail, and this was actually common throughout the medieval era in all regions, not just the Arab and Islamic world. Of course there are different types of chainmail, but it did form a good base for soldiers going off to war. However, not all soldiers would use chainmail. The horse archers didn't wear chainmail all the time because they would sometimes go for a padded gambeson or a padded overcoat. Because if you think about it, fast attacks on horseback with bows and arrows required flexibility and freedom of movement. Also, if you're attacking from a distance, you can afford to wear less armour. But that's not to say the archers who rode horses didn't wear coats of mail. So the padded overcoat was worn and used, and so was chainmail. But I would not say the soldiers engaging in the fierce fighting right in the middle of the battlefield would use the padded overcoat. So going on to the armour which would come on top of the chainmail was scale armour. In illustrations in certain fictional TV shows, you can see that scale armour is in a way associated with that region. I mean, it does look good, but the matter of the fact is that it was most likely not used. In general, scale armour didn't have much presence in history, regardless of the era and region you're looking at. It might have been used for horses, and some surviving armour from that period could show that. But in general, it wasn't popular and effective, so saying scale armour was used wouldn't be historically accurate. And this leaves us with the most likely option, which is lamellar armour. Lamellar armour sort of has this overlapping rectangular look. It could be leather or even steel plates. But lamellar armour can be associated with the Far East rather than the Islamic and Arab world. But the Far East did have some sort of influence in the Middle East. If you look at the Mongols, for example, they sacked the city of Baghdad in the 1200s. So they reached into the heart of the medieval Arab world. Also, the Turkish and Persian influence played a big role, and you will see this influence spreading to not just armour but also the weapons. The ghulams or Mamluks that were used by the Arab empires wore lamellar body armour. It was very common among these Turkman soldiers, which had a huge role in the development of Arab and Islamic armies. Also, in the 10th century, the Khurasani foot soldiers wore lamellar armour. In fact, lamellar armour can be seen being worn in the Arab armies from about the 9th century, I'd say. And this was because the bulk of the Abbasid armies were Turks and Persians. And this left an everlasting influence on armour in that region. But lamellar armour wasn't necessarily limited to Turks and Persians. There is some evidence which points to Arabs using lamellar armour. And a good example of that would be the Banu Hamid tribe, who were the rivals to the Hamdanids. And the Hamdanids were an Arab dynasty in northern Syria in the early medieval time. They used lamellar armour for their heavy cavalry, so it's clear this was the most common piece of body armour. But the problem is, I found it very difficult to find, which is why I had to use this plain leather cuirass for our medieval Arab soldier impression. Lamellar armour is very, very hard to find. It's not as available as steel armour. And believe me, I looked everywhere for an Islamic or Arab lamellar cuirass. I even asked back home in Lebanon, where I thought it would be common because you would more likely find it in an Arab country or in the Middle East. But still, I couldn't find it. So we have to settle with this for now. But if we want to pick out some sort of similarities, you can see that this looks similar to a rare piece of body armour that was used, which is a brigandine. A brigandine had iron plates from the inside, then was covered by a fabric coat. And Islamic examples of this are very rare. So we can say it looks similar to this for now, but we will definitely work on improving this impression in our future videos. And for the arms, they would most likely wear a vambrace made of plate, but we have leather ones for today, which will go on our arms on top of the chainmail armour. And then moving up to the most important part of the body to cover, which is your head. Helmets were most likely to be conical shaped. There were many variations of this, so it could have been a steel plate coming down through the middle of your head, or it would be a nasal guard, or it can have a small point going in the upwards direction. And they are known as turban helmets. Yes, Arabs and Muslims even use turbans for their armour when going off to war. It wasn't just worn for social life, which shows how important turbans were for them, and it formed a big, big part of their identity. An actual turban can be worn around the helmet, and also Islamic engravings on the helmet was likely, especially for high-ranking generals. This Islamic art can be seen on many surviving helmets. Some would even have a neck protection in the form of mail coming down from the helmet. But we, unfortunately, do not have this with us today as well. It was very, very hard to find a turban helmet, which is why I'll only be wearing a regular turban on my head when doing this impression. But there are many variations of medieval Arab and Islamic armour. Whether it was mail with a padded gambeson, leather or steel lamella armour, helmets also came in different forms. So constructing an impression can be a bit difficult, but we are going to give it a try. So that's enough of me talking, and let's roll back the years.